Hello, welcome everybody. I acknowledge that I'm speaking today on the land of the Darkinjung people, the custodians of this land, which was never ceded. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection and contribution to this land. I also acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been breathing life into the land and passing on knowledge with an oral tradition that's lasted thousands of generations. And I extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are listening today. So welcome to the 4th episode of the Brisbane Writers Festival Author and Illustrator series, which is a series of discussions with author-illustrators, who are those talented people who can spin magic with both words and images about their work, their creative processes, and what inspires them. So make sure you catch up with all previous episodes, which are all available online through the Brisbane Writers Festival website. I'm Sarah Davis. I'm an illustrator and Associate Art Director at Walker Books Australia, and I have the great pleasure today of speaking with Gavin Bishop, who's joining us from New Zealand. So welcome, Gavin.
Kia ora. He mihi nui ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Gavin Bishop ahau, no Aotearoa ahau, kia ora. I would just like to say I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm speaking to you from Ōtautahi or Christchurch in the South Island of New Zealand. And the little mihi that I just gave was a greeting in Maori, which is our Indigenous language. And it also is a reference to a little book that I've done recently for babies, which is called Mihi. And Mihi means greeting, but it's bigger than that. It means more than that. It actually tells you, tells others where you have come from and who you are, who your connections are, and even how your ancestors arrived here in this country from the South Pacific. So lovely to see you, Sarah.
You too. Yeah, it's a real treat. One of the things that I'm really hoping to talk to you about in your work today is that sense of place and of history that sort of permeates what you do. So that's lovely. And I should let people know a little bit about you before we begin. So you've been writing and illustrating for a very long time now, and have numerous accolades to your bow. So you've won many national book prizes, including the 2017 Sir Kingi Ihaka Award, recognising a lifetime contribution to strengthening Maori culture, which is incredible, and the 2018 Prime Minister's Award for Literary Achievement, I understand, as well as the supremely coveted Margaret Mahi Book of the Year Award. And Margaret Mahi was New Zealand picture book royalty, and the Elsie Locke Award for non-fiction. And your work's been exhibited internationally in numerous countries, including Japan and Czechoslovakia. So you've got a long history of book creation and storytelling and creating marvelous art. And I'm actually delighted to be talking to you today. I think I've mentioned this to you in the past when we met briefly at something else, but you hold a very special place in my heart. Because when I was 10, which seems like a million years ago now, you came to Elmwood Normal School, and a little group of us, who were probably the ones that couldn't sit still in class and got into trouble for drawing and maths and things like that, were shepherded into the library. And I think you spent an hour and a half talking to us about your work. And I was absolutely entranced and inspired and riveted. And I can still remember you sitting there in one of those tiny little kids' chairs, but with all your sketchbooks and your roughs. And I remember you were working on the roughs for Mrs. McGinty's Bazaar plant at the time. And I can vividly remember you holding up, one of your sketches that you've done. And and I had this little epiphany where I thought, I want to do that. And yeah, and here we are, many decades later. But
fantastic.
Yeah, it was, and I know I think I've heard you mention that you knew as a child that you wanted to become some kind of artist. Is that right?
Yeah. That story of yours, I've actually repeated that many times. I'm very proud of it as well. It's a lovely story, and I've told others about it many times.
Yeah, it was a formative experience for me, for sure. Thank you, Gavin. I'll just take the opportunity to say it now. But
well, thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to hear it in person, as it were, from you. Yeah, I actually always knew, when I was really, really little, at a primary school down near Queenstown, a little place called Kingston. I started school there, and there were only 12 of us at school, 12 students and one teacher. And I thought the teacher was really, really old, but he was 22. He was 20. And he had gone to that school as a little kid, and he came back, and it was his first teaching job. And I started school there when I was 4.5, because there was no kindergarten or anything in the area. But he used to say, or others used to say to me, because I was very tall for my age, he said, they used to say, well, you should be a policeman when you grow up because you're nice and tall. Because in those days, you had to be 6 feet tall to be a policeman. And I said, I don't want to be a policeman, I want to be an artist. And I don't really know if I knew what an artist was, or what they did, or how they made pictures. In fact, I probably hadn't even seen a real painting at that time. But I just sort of instinctively wanted to make artworks. And that was when I was about 4.
So it was just hardwired into you from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad you didn't become a policeman. It would have been a big loss to the world.
I'd hate to be a policeman.
You're doing exactly what you needed to be doing. But a lot of your books are actually autobiographical, aren't they? And
They are.
Yeah. And one of them's even set in Kingston, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Piano Rock.
A little bit about
this one here. This one here is a little, it's a little autobiography of the time that I lived in Kingston as a little kid. And that's me in the middle of those 2 other kids on the back of the horse. We used to ride a horse to school. It was only about a mile away. It wasn't very far. And there was this great big horse, and this young, I thought she was a woman, but she was a young girl. She owned the horse, and she used to give us a lift to school. And I used to get into the middle because I was the smallest. And when the horse arrived at school, I had to climb down the school gate to get off it because it was so high. So yeah, that's
a brilliant memory. And I mean, what I was saying before about how a lot of your work seems to stem from a really clear sense of your own place in the world and where you exist, and your sort of sense of history, like your own personal history, but also the history of the country, Aotearoa, in which you're, living and working. So how important is it to you to explore your own story, your own personal story, and draw inspiration from it?
It's the reason that I write books for children. It's the real reason. When I first started, and the first book I ever wrote was a book called Biddy Biddy about a sheep in the high country of the South Island. And I set out at that point, this is 1978, I started to write that book. And I set out with the purpose to tell New Zealand children stories about themselves and about their own place. Because at that time, it seems remarkable now looking back, because we've got a huge, huge publishing industry now that produces a lot of books about our country. But in 1978, very, very few, and I'm talking about like 1 or 2 a year, books for children were published that were set here in this country.
Wow. And
I set out thinking, that's what I want to change. That's what I'd like to do something about. And so I thought, what would I write that is essentially about New Zealand and something that I've actually experienced myself. And so I thought I'll write about a sheep, because when I was a kid in Kingston, we used to own a pet sheep. And I thought I'll write about a sheep because there were at the time something like 6 million sheep. And as Barry Humphries once said, that New Zealand has 6 million sheep and 4 million of them think they're people. So anyway, I started writing this book about a sheep, and I had no idea what I was doing. Absolutely no idea, because I'd been to university and studied to be a painter. I knew nothing about organizing material for a book with a limited number of pages. And so I just sort of jumped in at the deep end and floundered around. And eventually I sent what I'd produced to Oxford University Press in Wellington, and they thought it was great. They said, "Oh, it needs a lot of work. It's pretty rough." But they said, "We think it's great. We'd like to work on it with you." So that was the beginning of a very long, long process. And while I was working on that, I came up with another idea for another book set in Christchurch, where I live still. And I thought I'll write a story about somebody living in a suburb of Christchurch. And that's where I came up with the idea of Mrs. McGinty, the bizarre plant. And so that took off quite quickly, because by then I knew how to organize text, and I knew how to organize images that could be then scanned and printed into a book. And that's because I learned that by making the mistakes that I did on Biddy Biddy.
School of hard knocks.
It was a school of hard knocks. I wouldn't take no for an answer. I just kept going and going and going. And I listened very carefully to people like Wendy Harricks, who was my editor at Oxford University Press. And, you know, what I learned was invaluable, absolutely wonderful.
It's interesting because, you know, as you say, today there's a much sort of bigger publishing industry in New Zealand. Yes. And a publishing community and online resources, you know, where you can look at what everyone's doing internationally, and you know, the world's your oyster. But yeah, back when you began, you were really sort of creating in a vacuum, basically, and having to feel your way towards a goal that you just instinctively knew you wanted to head for. You know, you were basically...
Well, you must remember yourself, you know, the number of books there were about New Zealand written by New Zealanders. There were very, very few.
Very few.
Even when you were young, weren't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And but they were treasured.
yeah, I know. But, yes, but it just didn't happen. I don't know why.
Yeah. So you've, I mean, in a way, it must make things slightly difficult for you in terms of your career. You know, because New Zealand still is a very geographical.
You're absolutely right.
So obviously you're doing it because you feel very strongly about that, the importance of that kind of sense.
I do. I was teaching at the same time, so I had an income from a job. And so I wasn't relying upon writing and illustrating for my livelihood. I was teaching at high school at the same time that I was doing this. So it was a kind of a hobby. Then in my early 50s, I decided to leave teaching because I thought that if I didn't leave and become a writer, full-time writer, it would only ever be a hobby, would only ever be a sort of a, you know, thing I did on the side. And so I took the plunge, and that's over 20 years ago. I took the plunge and left teaching and became a full-time writer and illustrator, which I've never regretted. It was a great thing to do. Great move.
You taught for almost 30 years, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
And I wondered about that in terms of you sort of like your, you know, obviously you've got this instinct to create art and tell stories, and you've also got this instinct to nurture, you know, talent in other people. And I think, am I right in thinking that Storylines actually created an award?
Yes, they did.
You to encourage new and emerging illustrators.
And that's offered every 2 years,
right,
to an unpublished illustrator in New Zealand. And we've had some terrific results from that. I think we've had about 6 or maybe 7 winners so far, and that's like every 2 years they offer this award. And they've just been terrific. And some of them have gone on to make a career out of it, and have had quite a lot of extra books published after their first one. So part of the prize is to be mentored by me while they're working on the book, and then the book is published by Penguin Random House. And then they get a few $1,000s as well. So it's quite a good prize. It's
yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah,
that would really kickstart someone's career. And you know, it's quite different to your experience of basically having to sort of piece it together and vacuum in isolation.
That's right.
It's really lovely that you're kind of fostering that sort of, you know, I mean, helping the publishing community in New Zealand thrive and mentoring new illustrators to get into the industry. And I imagine that, you know, the teaching instinct comes in really handy for that as well.
I think, yeah, that's right. But the whole publishing industry in New Zealand, and it's probably the same in Australia, is that things have taken off and developed and have become much more mature. When I first started, there were very few professional book designers. You know, I think there were 2 or 3 people who were good at designing books. And so our books tended to look a little bit sort of homemade, you know, a little bit amateurish. Yeah. But now we have got terrific publishers.
Well, we're going to get onto the production values of Atua later, because it's stunning book. Yeah. So in terms of working with publishers, I know you've worked a lot with Gecko Press and Penguin Random House. What other New Zealand publishing houses have you?
I started with Oxford University Press, and then they closed down after, I don't know, about 10 years of my being with them. And luckily I was picked up by Scholastic New Zealand. And I worked with them for quite a long time. And then Random House asked me to do a book with them. And so that began a new relationship. And then Gecko Press started up in Wellington. And I can't quite remember how I said to them, oh, I know what it was. I worked with Joy Cowley on some books of hers. And they were being published by Gecko Press. Things like Snake and Lizard, and there were 2 or 3 of those, and a few other things of hers. I've also worked with Wendy Pye, who specializes in writing reading material, learning to read books for schools.
Oh, brilliant.
And that was quite interesting. I did about 30 or so of those, I think.
Wow.
But it was, they had very, very strict guidelines, you know. They were very age specific. And I had to learn how to write a reading book for a beginning reader. And
did you enjoy the challenge of working within?
Oh, they were quite fun. They were quite fun, really, because you know, there were very, very strict rules. Like for a beginning reader, a book has only 8 pages, and the page 1 is the title page. So you've got 7 pages to tell the story in, and page 8 has to have a punchline and a conclusion. And there has to be lots of repetition. You can't introduce too many new words as you go along, and you're only allowed 1 sentence per page. So they were the rules.
Story challenge. Yeah, that's amazing.
The first one I wrote was called Spider, And I wrote it just in one go, and it just worked. And that was the only time I ever did that. All the others I agonized over for weeks.
And sometimes you originate, the ideas for your book, and then sometimes publishers actually approach you with a concept.
Yeah, that's happening more. Yeah.
Was a publisher approached you with that concept for Aotearoa, and then you ran with it. So be interested to hear a little bit about what that sort of collaborative process is like of actually sort of picking up a concept from a publisher and then developing it, and how much input they have, and how, the sort of back and forth of ideas. And
well, you see, for most of my career, I have initiated my own ideas, my own stories, my own, idea for a book, unless I'm doing work with somebody else. So I don't do that very often because I like to be in control of the whole thing, really. But then about 5 or 6 years ago, publishers started to, they weren't so interested in what I was coming up with, to put it bluntly. And they would sort of say, oh, yes, that's a very good idea, but we would like you to consider doing a book about, for example, the history of New Zealand for the last 64 million years. I said, oh, yeah.
Could knock that off before breakfast.
Yeah, and I said, but that sounds very exciting. That sounds very interesting. They said, yes, but you're only allowed 64 pages to tell that entire story in. And I said, oh, okay. So I sort of hung up on the telephone, and we're speaking on the phone. I hung up and I sort of kind of had a bit of a meltdown. I thought, my God, I can't do that. That's just impossible, utterly impossible. Well, so I started making lists of things that I thought could be included in a history like that. And then I think probably with the help of the publishers, they came up with the idea of having a double-page spread for every chapter. So we've got a double-page spread about the European, about the Polynesian discovery of Aotearoa, and how the early Polynesian settlers came here and established a new home for themselves. So that was a double-page spread. There's a lot of material there that has to go into that, only to allow 2 pages. Then it was the same later on in the book when I dealt with the New Zealand land wars, where the British arrived and wanted more and more land from the Maori. I was only allowed 2 pages for that. So it was.
So you've got these hugely complex, sensitive topics that you're trying to distill into a double-page spread.
Yeah.
Those educational readers were really good practice. Really is.
Really good. So I had to read all this material, and then I had to whack it all back, chop it all back, so that it was just like a sketch, really. But I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed doing it because I was allowed to make it funny in places. And I also managed to include members of my own family.
Brilliant.
So when we looked at fashion of New Zealand through the ages, I managed to find some old photographs of my parents on their honeymoon in Christchurch. I found another photograph of my Uncle Jack at the races in Invercargill. And I did drawings of these because they're suddenly really, really old-fashioned. Really old-fashioned. I mean, in those days when people went to the races, they got dressed up, double-breasted suits with a hat.
And pocket squares.
Yeah, yeah. So I managed to slip little drawings of my family into places too. So that just made it more interesting.
Oh, that's brilliant. So you obviously get quite a lot of satisfaction from the process of researching these books.
I do. So after Aotearoa, Penguin Random House came up with the idea of doing a similar book, sort of similar format. I mean, here it is here, about the wildlife of Aotearoa. And they said, we'd like you to take the same sort of approach. So I did. For example, you get all these little bits of information scattered over the page with little bits of visual and written information like that. So you can read it, catch it, but it has a title up here, and that tells you what you can find on that page. It's a whole lot of separate double pages like that. I'll go this way. Here's another one of Kiwi.
Brilliant.
And so what I did.
So each spread is themed.
Like a theme. Yeah, it's got a theme. And holding it all together is the story of the long-finned eel, which is endemic to New Zealand. You cannot find them anywhere else in the world. They only live here. I mean, we've got short-finned eels too, which I think Australia has as well. But here in Aotearoa, we have long-finned eels. And here's some more over here. And they live in rivers and lakes all of their lives. And then when they sort of sense it, they leave these lakes and they swim out to sea and go north as far as Tonga, where they breed, produce the eggs, which hatch into these little, little eel, elvers they're called, and they swim back to New Zealand and live here until it's their turn to go. It's just amazing. It's the most amazing story. So I've used their story. Here they are here on the front cover here. I've used their story to hold the whole book together.
Well, that's interesting, because that's one of the things that I sort of made a note that I wanted to ask you about, particularly because I think one of the incredible things that you do with your work, I mean, like we've just seen from that book, your nonfiction's incredibly rich. You've only got a page to work with, but you manage to really, get maximum leverage from that page and really embellish it with, texture and detail and all these little facts and facets and things. But the other thing that you managed to do, which I think is quite rare, is somehow fuse all of that sort of non-fiction content and that sort of, the interesting knowledge and factual information with your kind of love of storytelling. So you always seem to have a narrative thread that sort of ties it all together.
Yeah.
Which I think is a really, really clever thing to do and really unusual. I know you did a similar thing in Cook's Cook as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about that aspect of things, and how you kind of managed to combine, that love of storytelling with the factual.
Gecko Press is my other publisher, and they have in recent years initiated projects for me. And I love working this way because most of the books that I do with Penguin Random House are big books, great big things that take a hell of a lot of research and a huge amount of time. But a lot of the books that I do with Gecko are the complete opposite. Things like Mihi, which I've just shown you, which is a baby's book. It's a board book, and it's about family. And this one's in Maori, and this one is my latest one. It's about friends, or in Maori it's ehoa, and it's about a child with a dog. So again, very, very, very simple, used for introduction. Now, but on one occasion, the Gecko Press said to me, well, there's the 200th anniversary of Cook's first voyage to this part of the world, Captain Cook's first voyage. And they said, how about doing a book to commemorate that for children? And I said, do you realize how many books there are out there about Captain Cook? There are hundreds. Yes, and they said, that's all right. That's okay. I'm sure you'll come up with something different. So I thought, again, you know, kind of after I'd finished my meltdown, I quietly started reading some books about Captain Cook's first voyage, the one in 1769. And I came across this guy, and he was the cook on board the Endeavour. And what was really interesting is that he only had one hand.
Right.
Now, seemingly it was common in those days to give those sorts of jobs to naval people who had been injured in some way at sea. And the British Navy felt obliged to offer them employment, even though they couldn't go to war anymore, they couldn't fight, but they were given employment on this huge number of ships that the British had at that time. And so the first cook that was sent along to the Endeavour, when the Endeavour was being sort of refurbished ready for this voyage down to the South Pacific, the first cook they sent along only had one leg. And James Cook said, no, that's absolutely not acceptable. We cannot have a cook with only one leg. He'd never be able to stand up in the rough weather. So the next cook they sent along was this guy with only one hand. And I'm just trying to remember his name because it's a while since I did this book. That doesn't really matter. Oh, his name was John Thompson. And of course, one of the reasons that John Thompson jumped out at me is that when I was teaching, a guy that I used to teach with was called John Thompson. And suddenly this name jumped out of this book that I was reading. So there's very little known about this cook, except that he was on the voyage, he was on the Endeavour voyage, he made it to New Zealand, and then on their way back, when the Endeavour visited the East Indies, he got a terrible illness and died. Oh, no. So he didn't make it home.
He had the voyage of a lifetime.
Yeah, it was his last voyage ever. And so I read a lot about the law, kind of folklore on ships at the time. And one of the things I found really interesting was that a lot of the sailors who died on these voyages never made it back home, and they were buried at sea. And the other sailors believed that they turned into seabirds. Oh. And so here's a big picture.
Beautiful.
of the dead on the ship turning into things like albatrosses and seagulls and things like that. And this is the cook here with his one hand, and he is just gradually turning into a bird. And then he follows the ship for the rest of the voyage. Here he is here, and he offers advice to the people who are trying to cook and to fill his place. And the other interesting thing I found was that because so many people died on this voyage, people from Banks's lot and some of the officers and the captain all had to fill the spaces where these other people, the spaces that other people had who had died. And they had to draw landscapes as they sailed by. And quite a few of the drawings that we've got of early New Zealand and of Batavia and places like that, and the voyage home, were actually done by James Cook himself. Because these are the equivalent of photography, you know, photographs. That was the way they were recorded.
I didn't realise that.
No, I didn't either. I didn't know any of this. Knew nothing about it. And so over here on the rigging, all the previous, all the other dead. And so there is actually, this is a correct number of seabirds, of the correct number of people who died in Batavia of
that's astonishing.
Diseases they picked up there. And so one of the themes that runs through the whole book is the idea that John Thompson, the one-handed cook, is desperate to have some kind of physical feature named after him. And he suggests quietly to the captain, as they go along, saying, they come across the strait, you see, between the North Island and the South Island, and John Thompson suggests that it might be called Thompson's Strait. But Cook says, Cook Strait. And then he looks at something else and he says, oh, how about Thompson's Island? And Cook says, North Island. So he doesn't get his way. And right at the very end, one of the things that he was most famous for making was porridge, the cook. And so here, at the very last page, we have him as a seagull with a spoon under his half wing, saying, perhaps we could call it Thompson's porridge.
Thompson's porridge.
I don't know if it was. The other story I came across was this goat. And the goat was on her second voyage around the world. And she traveled on the ship specifically to provide fresh milk for the officers' coffee.
Good on her. That's an important service.
And the whole voyage reminded me of Dr. Dolittle, because there was this huge number of animals on board, pigs and sheep, and I don't think there was any cattle, but there was one goat, and of course these animals were all sort of, you know, eaten. And of course, Joseph Banks, he paid something like the equivalent of, I think it was something like $3 million in today's money to go on that voyage.
Wow. Just for the privilege of discovering new plants and flora and fauna and and the joy of research and discovery.
Yes. And two of the men that he took with him were black men from the Indies, and one of them had previously worked for a botanist, and therefore we don't know enough about this, but obviously that guy was very instrumental in collecting information about plants, but he's never been given the credit for it.
Never credited. Gosh. Well, yeah, I mean, that sort of answers my question about you know, how you've got these incredibly engaging sort of storylines and motifs and characters running through what is, you know, also a very, very information rich book. And clearly that's, you know, that's down to your instinct for, you know, a good story. You know, you're doing your research and you come across something that, you know, a little bit sort of iconoclastic or eccentric, or, you know, a new take on things, and you kind of fuse that into a really engaging way in to the sort of factual content for readers. Like it's a beautiful alchemy that you've got going on there, I think.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's basically what I find interesting myself.
Yes, you've really got an eye for the.
I like those kind of little quirky. Yeah,
so it's picking up on a quirky little detail which somebody else might completely gloss over, or a you know, like a superstition like the birds being the ghosts of drowned sailors, and then actually amplifying that and creating a, you know, a sort of an incredible narrative with it. It's great. So that's and I think your your work is pretty broad ranging, isn't it? I mean, you've done you get inspiration from Maori myths and European fairy stories and nursery rhymes and the environment and history and culture. And I mean, the hard bit must be that process of distilling it and working out what to put in and what to leave out.
Yes, that's right. And how to tell it simply and succinctly is always a challenge.
Yeah, so those little readers really are a sort of a motif for your working process, aren't they? And I mean, the other thing that really impresses me is, am I right in thinking you work pretty much completely traditionally?
Yeah.
And your layouts, your compositions on the page are often so complex, and you're trying to combine so many different elements into, you know, a huge spread with multiple, you know, facets to it. That must be quite a challenge when you're just, I mean, a lot of people will jump on the computer and cheat and move things around. Not that it's cheating, honestly, but you know, move things around.
Well, I don't use a computer because I can't really, and I'm not actually prepared to spend the enormous amount of time that I'd need to get on top of that.
But I wonder if it, do you think, I mean, it probably is actually part of your process, of this process of distillation, like making those decisions and working with your hands, like, might be quite.
I really enjoy making images with my hands and using paint and using ink. I use a variety of things like monoprint. Yeah, monoprints. You know, where you just get one print off the thing that you've made. The thing I really enjoy is using materials that sometimes cause accidents.
Yeah.
And those accidents can be absolutely wonderful. So I remember reading once, Morris Sendak said that the art of good illustration is to make it look as if it was easy. And he said, if you don't, and he said, one slip up and you've lost the game. It has to be, the whole thing has to look, whoa, this must have been easy to do. I could do that until you try it. And then you realize, it's like, I always sort of say this to kids when I'm speaking to them at school. I said, it's a bit like a really good athlete. You know, you see a really good athlete running and you think, oh, that looks easy. Look how easily they did that. I could do that, until you try. And that's what I think the same for illustration, is that it should look as if, oh, that can't have taken long, because it looks pretty easy. And it should look relaxed and comfortable. And I think if it looked as if it was hard and you haven't quite sort of got on top of it,
you're still fighting with it.
Yeah, you're still fighting with it.
So how do you actually, you know, arrange things on the page? Like, what's your process for revising and fine-tuning?
The most helpful thing that I use is tracing paper. I trace things, and if you could just trace the picture and you can move things around. The other thing that I find is really helpful is I hire by the month a photocopier from Fuji Xerox. And that means that I can enlarge and reduce a drawing without any bother. So if I find that a drawing is too big for a particular page, you know, I may have done the sketch and I quite like the sketch, but it's too big for the space I want it in, especially nowadays when I'm working on these big books with a lot of information, because I'm also working with a designer who has to slip the text into spaces that I leave for him on the page. And if he says to me, that picture is too big, I think, damn, I can't redraw that and get it as good as that was now. So I simply put it on the photocopier and zap it down a few notches. And there it is. It's just brilliant. It's wonderful.
Nice. Well, it's interesting that, you know, it sounds like you do a lot of sort of cutting and pasting. And
I do.
But then your end result has such beautiful compositional flow, and it feels so seamless, you know, like you say, it looks, I'm not sure that it looks easy, but it certainly has a sense of, you know, harmony and effortlessness on the page. So yeah, again, it's that process of synthesis, I suppose, at the end.
Yeah. Yes.
Like Atua is, well, yeah, I've been really looking forward to talking to you about Atua. So
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Jump onto that before we run out of time, even though I could probably just sit here and talk to you all day quite happily. Okay. But Atua is absolutely stunning, and that was one of the things that really struck me with that book. Yeah, I mean, look at it. It's just absolutely glorious, and it's a feast. It's sort of every illustrator's dream to have a publisher that will, I mean, look at that. Look at that. Is that embossing?
Look at the way it catches the light. Yes, it's embossed.
Yeah, stunning. So and
little, see the little,
yeah, it's
got little Atua, little god.
So the Atua and is that Maui on the cover?
No, it's Tawhaki.
Tawhaki.
He was an ancestor of Maori,
right?
And he was a demigod, and he his grandmother was the goddess of thunder, and he was a ladies' man. He had lots and lots of affairs and lots of relationships and lots of children. And on one particular occasion, he fell in love with a young woman, or she fell in love with him. She saw him sleeping, and she thought, "Oh, he looks all right." And she was living up in the heavens, and so she came down and made a connection. Oh, here she is, here, up there.
Beautiful.
Up there. And they fell in love. And quite, you know, eventually they had a child. And Tawhaki said, well, I'm going to break with tradition, and I'm going to take that child and I'm going to baptize that child down at the creek, down at the river. And so the mother, her name was Hapai. Hapai said to Tawhaki, okay, here's our daughter, take her and baptize her. Well, as Tawhaki took the daughter, he said stupidly to his partner, this baby is a bit smelly. And Hapai said, how dare you speak like that about my baby? I'm absolutely offended. So she grabbed the child. She said, give me the child. You will not have the honor of baptizing her. And so she jumped up into on top of the wharenui. You can see here, there's the tickle down there.
Oh, yeah.
And she stands on top of the tickle, which is a kind of an offensive thing to do anyway, because that's somebody's head. And she jumps off into the sky and floats back to one of the layers of heaven. There were about, I can't remember how many there were, about 7 or 8, maybe 10 layers of heaven. And she went back to the layer where she had lived previously. And she stayed there with the child. Well, Tawhaki was absolutely distraught. He's down here, and he spent his days just weeping and moaning and saying what a stupid fool he was. And then he decided that he would go and climb up into the heavens and try and find her, try and find his partner and his daughter.
And baby.
And so he goes and sees his grandmother, who by this stage has become blind because she was a cannibal, and she foolishly poisoned one of her servants. And her husband made her eat, because she was a cannibal. She ate the servant, and the poison in the servant's body turned the old woman blind. It's very complicated. It's a wonderful story.
She sounds like a charmer.
She's fantastic. And she was sitting outside her hut counting kumara on the ground. And she was counting them, and Tawhaki and his brother turned up and decided that they would take a couple away to tease her. And so she would count them and she'd say, hello, I'm 2 short, or I'm 3 short. And then she suddenly realized that she was being tricked. And then Tawhaki said, look, I want you to help me climb up to the heavens to find my wife. And she said, okay, but be careful. You climb only on the vines that are rooted in the ground. His brother didn't listen. He didn't listen. And the vines sailed out over the sea. So anyway, eventually he climbed up there. And when he got up to the heavens where his wife was living, he came across these men who were building a waka. And he turned himself into an old man as a disguise. And the young guys said to him, you know, what are you looking for? And he said, oh, I'm just, you know, I've just come here. It was very vague. But eventually he joins up with his wife again, and he takes his daughter, who is now much older, down to the river for her baptism. And they live happily ever after. And from time to time, they turn themselves into 2 black moths, and they revisit the earth, Papatuanuku, and to see what's going on down here.
Well, I think that's given us a wonderful taste of how you manage to make these tales so kind of accessible and fresh and entrancing. I mean, yeah, I would happily just sit here and have you read the whole book to me. That would be my ideal morning. Because these are, I mean, you know, these are, you start way back in Te Po, right back at the beginning in the nothingness, and move through creation into these pages that just teem with life and these epic tales of gods and demigods and human heroes and things. And then it's all interspersed with the, you know, the natural world and the flora and fauna of Aotearoa, and it's, you know, it's like you've woven this incredibly rich tapestry, but you've made these I mean these stories are relevant today, aren't they? Like, do you sort of see these myths and legends as a bit of a blueprint for how to live, or a bit of a...
Well, I think what is interesting, I mean, we're undergoing a huge change here in New Zealand at the moment, and it's very, very exciting. People are waking up to what we have here that cannot be found anywhere else in the world. In fact, this year, we're going to celebrate Matariki for the first time. We're having a holiday to celebrate Matariki. That's the Maori New Year.
Which is wonderful.
It is fabulous. It is so exciting. And so all of these, the other thing that people are, the general public are now starting to understand, is that these stories, these myths, are part of every Maori person's life, because they believe that they are descendants of Ranginui, the Sky Father, and Papa Tuanuku, the Earth Mother. They are the progenitors of all life on Earth. And that's why there are very interesting issues about ecology. You don't look after your mother, how can you expect to have a healthy place to live? You need to look after the land. And one of the biggest breakthroughs, I think, lately has been the naming of one of the rivers in the North Island, and acknowledging the fact that it's a personality, that it is actually a being. It's
not a piece of land that can be owned, and
it's not just a drain. So all of these offspring are part of the Maori, a Maori person's ancestry can be traced right back to these creatures, and book opens up like this, so we can see some of the other.
And I mean, it's delightful too that you know, your publisher has obviously really put a lot of love and time and thought into you know, the production values and giving these myths the stage that they deserve. Well, not, I mean, not myths, I keep calling them myths, but really they're sort of much more than that. But you know, like it's just it's glorious to see because I remember you saying at one point that when you were at school in the 1950s, Maori history was invisible or grossly sort of distorted and misrepresented. So I imagine it's quite amazing to see, you know, to come from that to where you are now, and where New Zealand and Aotearoa is now.
That's right.
As a country.
And another big breakthrough is the introduction of New Zealand history into New Zealand history into schools. The introduction of the new New Zealand history syllabus, which is amazing because, well, we learned, when I was at school, we learned a little bit about the land wars, but it was very biased towards the British. You know, it was the bad Maori, you know, fighting when the good, lovely British settlers wanted to come and live here and have farms. The fact that the land was confiscated from them now because they didn't want to always sell it. Oh, it's just amazing.
So, I mean, I know you don't write with a didactic purpose or an agenda, that you're writing from what's important to you and what you want to celebrate and uphold and share with people. But you know, it obviously goes a long way to sort of redressing the balance and you know, shining on things that deserve to be celebrated and properly represented. Yeah, it's absolutely. And are you working on anything at the moment? Do you have?
I am.
Can you share? Is it top secret, or can you share what's
well, it's sort of a secret, but I can tell
you. We won't tell you.
It's another monster. It's another monster book, and so far I've spent probably 18 months on text.
Goodness.
And it's about the New Zealand land wars.
Wow.
For children.
So another massive topic that you're going to condense down into. Is this one going to be?
Same size as this. Same size as this. And this time it will have 3 gatefolds.
Wow.
Like these things here. Like these.
Every illustrator's dream to get gatefolds. You're so lucky.
The gatefold becomes almost a metre wide.
Wow.
It's almost a metre of picture. You know, it's huge.
Stunning.
So, and I've chosen to illustrate 3 of the major pa that were built by Maori. Rua Peka Peka up in Northland in about 1843 or no, 1845, I think. Then there is the big pa Rangiriri in the Waikato. That's 1863. And then the most amazing pa built by Titoku Waru over near over in Taranaki some years after that. And so these are going to be spread over a metre wide, and I'm hoping to make these images unlike anything anyone else has produced. And so there's lots and lots of portraits in this book, and I'm using for the first time a scratch board technique.
For the entire book?
No, just for the portraits.
Right.
And what I'm going to do is photocopy them on my photocopier, and I'm going to chop them up and stick them onto watercolor paintings in the background.
Mm.
So
sort of collage.
Yeah, I'll collage them. Have you ever done sketchboard?
I have done a little bit, yeah. So it's got the layer of chalk and then the layer of ink, and you
That's right, and you scratch into the ink, yeah.
Mm.
So sometimes they work really, really well, and other times they sort of look a bit sort of, you know, have to redo that one. So I'm also, again, to give this book my own stamp, or my own personality, is I'm weaving stories of my own family into this, because my grandfather, some quirk of nature, on mum's side, mum's father, he was born in 1847, my grandfather, which is very weird. So my great grandmother, who was Maori, she was born in 1820. And so I am weaving their stories because they were living in the Waikato during the war. My grandfather was 16 years old when the gunboats sailed up the Waikato River to attack Medimid. And so they must have all seen these things. But by the time I was born, my grandfather had been dead for 10 years. He was a very old man. And I don't think he ever told my mother anything about his experiences as a young boy. And the only thing he ever told her about her family was she was the youngest born. She was the youngest of 5. And she was born when her father was 68. Just get on that.
Wow.
He was 68 when she was born. So she was quite young still when he died as an old man. But the one thing he did say to her is that he had given her all the names. She didn't know what that meant. Nobody ever explained to her what it meant. It was only many years later, after she had died, that my brother and I became more and more and more interested in this part of the family story. We suddenly realized that these names were her whakapapa. So the 2 names that he gave her were Irihapeti and Hinapau. Well, it turned out that Irihapeti was her grandmother, the daughter of Te Wherowhero, the first Maori king, and her great-grandmother was Hinapau, who was a young girl who had been captured and taken to the Waikato, and she married Te Wherowhero and had a child, and she died 3 days later. And that child turned out to be my great-grandmother. And if you'd like to wait for a second, I'll find a picture of it.
Oh,
Here she is. This is her.
I swear I've seen that photo.
You probably have. It's very well known.
Yeah.
Very well known.
That is a very familiar face.
Yeah. Well, that's my great-grandmother.
Beautiful.
Her name is Irihapeti Te Paehaho Te Wherowhero. And this is a photograph taken, I think, I've done a lot of research into this, I think probably about 1860, a year after her husband died. He drowned. And here she is in mourning costume.
Oh, it's lovely to make acquaintance.
And if you look at this picture, it's got Burton Brothers here. Now, the Burton Brothers were a photography company in Dunedin, and they went up to the Waikato to take photographs in the 1880s, 20 years after this photograph was taken. They bought the rights to this photograph off a photographic company in Auckland, and they stuck their name on it.
Wow.
And now And now people think that the Burton brothers took that photograph, and they didn't. And here is, yeah.
No, carry on.
And here is my scratch board.
Oh, beautiful.
My scratch board of her that I'm going to include as part of an illustration.
Oh, that's brilliant. And I think that's the perfect note to end on, because we've come full circle. We started off talking about your family and your sense of place and how that kind of found its way into your work. And here we are with your latest book and your great-grandmother. Great-grandmother?
Yeah, great-grandmother.
Yeah. So that's a beautiful note to sort of end on. And I'd like to ask you one more question before we go, which is one that I'm asking everyone that I talk to in this series, which is when you're working on a project and you're immersed in what you're doing and you're in the flow and it's all going swimmingly, and you're creating your artworks. If the inside of your head was a physical space at that moment and you could go into it and walk around and have a look around, what sort of a space would you be standing in?
Not a very big one. quite small, really. It'd be probably a bit like my studio, which you can see a bit of in the background here. It's just a very small room, and it's crowded with rubbish. And that's what I think my head is like inside. It's got all these little bits and pieces, and every now and then, I rely on my subconscious an enormous amount. If I really can't solve a problem that I'm having, either with a story or with an image, I rely on my subconscious to sort it out for me. And quite often it happens just as I'm going to sleep. I suddenly think, that's what I need to do. That's all I need to do. Is just, change that, get rid of that, add that, and it will work.
Brilliant. You have a revelation just as you're drifting off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad that you've got such a talent for taking all the little bits of rubbish in your head and distilling them into objects of great beauty for us all to kind of enjoy. And I'm also very glad that you didn't become a policeman. So it's been a real pleasure, Gavin.
Oh, my.
I'll really look forward to seeing the next book coming out soon.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely talking with you.
You
Just
too.
terrific.